Hello and welcome to On Second Thought with Mike and Luke, an ongoing conversation about ideas and current events. Together we make sense of the chaos and confusion by exploring underlying connections and deeper motivations within us. We want to discover what's really true and in the process develop an antiviral mindset in a culture of decay. My name is Luke.
And I'm Mike.
That's Mike over there. And I'm undecided, Mike, if the take turns back and forth saying our name it feels a little goofy to me.
Does it?
But it also
Take
feels
it out
like
then.
fun.
Yeah.
But usually I'm a little averse to fun, so I have to open up my mind. All right. I have a question for you.
Well, what are we discussing today?
We're going to that's a good point. We're going to discuss, we still need to discuss Israel.
Yeah,
It feels
we'll
like
have a
the
little more
pressing issue
Israel.
of the day. But we've got some climate change and COVID and what's the next crisis, and then maybe talk a little
Strategic
politics.
adjustments by the left.
And you threatened to talk about Christian nationalism again. I
I
noticed
did.
one of our recent videos on
Yeah,
that
yeah.
didn't get as many views. I wonder how many people might be tired
How
of
recent?
it. Oh, the last 2 episodes ago.
Oh
but
yeah,
I
that's
don't
when
know.
we made the most ground.
It was. That's true. I know. Well, I've noticed that people really want to fight.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this too, about what gets views and what do people, not just what do people want, but what do they need,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And one of the things I long for, or I don't know if long for is the right word, but I'm looking for in a podcast is certainty, like a teacher explaining a concept.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we don't tend to, I definitely have a teacher mode, and so do you,
That's
but
not what
we don't really do
this
that.
has been geared towards at least.
And so we don't come out with the certainty of like, okay, here's the right thing. We're not preaching, and we hope that's what more people are hungry for too. But I noticed the podcasts I listen to, it's a lot of preaching, whether it's about the Bible or politics. Like it's just, there's a
assertive, you're
confidence.
saying.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Do you want to do that? Would you rather do that? I do see you
there
jump
are
to
times-
your gaining listeners discussing versus teaching.
Yeah, it came up.
We're skipped over our thing. That's fine. Let's just start there. Do you want to do that, or do you feel like maybe we should? Why?
I mean, I don't
I
want
can
to force
understand.
it.
Yeah.
Do you know what
yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like if we're just taking turns ranting, we're not learning. Part of what I love about doing this
How many
is
people
learning stuff.
do you listen to that do that with more than one person?
Oh, like the podcasts I listen to almost always have more than one person. Yeah, and it used to never
Even
be.
in that mode of asserting things.
That's right, and they'll just take turns, literally.
Really?
It'll be like, what do you want to say, Mike? And then Michael's preach for a while, and then it'll be like, okay, what do you want to say to the next person?
Yeah.
And they'll go back and
It
forth.
doesn't strike me as I don't listen to Joe Rogan in the way that you and Nicole do, but that strikes me as much more inquiring,
Sort
exploring.
of. Joe is inquiring. He'll definitely get into asserting.
Yeah.
But he's trying to draw out the expertise because that's what he
yeah.
finds to be interesting. So
Yeah,
he
he's
wants that person to
interviewing.
teach.
He's interviewing.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
true. That's the different. We're neither of us. We actually thought about that early on, and we thought that doesn't work well.
Well, and like I was saying, what I love about doing this and the podcast that I wanted to listen to,
Yeah.
that I don't think is out there, is 2 people trying to learn and figure things out.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we do well. So,
Yeah.
All right, my actual opening question
All right.
is a quote from George Patton. I'm kind of curious
George Patton quote. Okay.
how far this applies.
George C. Pat.
I don't know, the awesome one. Is there more than one? All right, so he says this: nobody ever defended anything successfully. There is only attack and attack and attack some more. So my question is, does that apply to Christianity? Does it apply to culture war, spiritual battles? He was famous for saying that every fortification, every foxhole dug was a waste of time. We're only attacking or retreating, but we're never
And
sitting
I'm
down.
sure he wouldn't want to be pushed to complete extremes on that, but it's a general principle. And in football, right? They talk about football in particular because it's violent, but the best defense is a good offense.
Yeah,
And they talk about when you try to protect the lead, that's when you end up losing.
right.
And yet Tiger was famous for getting ahead 4 shots, and he says, I'm just going to play good golf and not make mistakes and force them to catch me. They won't be able to catch me.
Right.
And so he didn't play with the same aggression, right? He played to force them to catch him, which is interesting because he was
There is an
definitely a
attack
dominant.
strategy. I feel like when there's a strategy such as that, I'm going to make them make mistakes.
Yeah,
That's still a form of attack in my mind.
yeah.
But you're right.
more
It's a
conservative
defensive.
then.
It's a conservative. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so the general sentiment I think probably has some real thing to it. Even think about this: the one of the large statements in Scripture where Jesus ended up saying to his disciples about their life in front of them is, Peter, you're going to be renamed. You're a rock, and da 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 da. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against you.
Right.
It is not that you'll be protected against assault, so that's true.
Yeah.
It is that when you are on this offensive, these strongholds, places won't stand against you.
It is interesting because that does feel like a defensive description, right? That when they attack you,
Yeah.
but it's the gates themselves that you're going after.
Yes. It sounds like you're defending yourself, but when you look at the words, he's actually assuming you're assaulting.
Right. Oh, see, and I've, like in Ephesians 6, we've talked about this recently.
Yes, I was just going to go there next.
You're taking your stand.
Yeah.
And so that feels like a defensive posture.
That's
too.
right. And the bulk of the armor is to protect in that stand.
Right.
But then the action is actually a attack
Attacking.
action.
Yeah.
It's not attack. It's not waiting.
Well, and you
That's why I wonder if
can't defeat your enemy defending.
No, that's right.
Like you just can't.
That's correct.
But if Patton is right, and I studied Patton a little bit, and studied strategies of war a little bit, and that this idea reverberates in my study. It seems what he's saying is that the conservative mindset, the conserving, protecting, territorial, like this is my territory, it always leads to loss. Doesn't work.
So we're going way, way back to an early discussion we had, and I would still say, you've mentioned it a few times, it doesn't resonate with me when you say that. When you
Right.
say that, I say and go on, but I don't, I think of myself as a conservative, and
Yeah.
I don't feel that the primary dynamic is one of conserving. So I know that you say that and you think about it, and we've talked a little bit about it, but it has never rung true to me. I don't feel that as the inner definition of conservative,
Right.
as protecting something.
Well, so why not? Because I mean, when I think of a conservative, I've worked in very conservative environments, not politically or religiously.
Yeah.
But a conservative mindset, meaning that this is the way we do it, and we're not going to change.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of what we call conservatism politically that is that. We just don't want to change.
I think there's a difference between conservative as a title for a political party and conservative as an adjective. Conservative as an adjective, I would agree with you. Conservative as an adjective is a protective, hunker down posture. Even conservative as an adjective for, let's say, you're going to invest finances. You're going to say, I don't want to lose my...
But if the word doesn't mean conservative when we use it in political conversation, we probably shouldn't use it, don't you think?
Well, that could be true, but you have the same problem with a liberal. We use liberal originated is a great word. It's really a word that was described all parties of the United States as an approach to this. If you are on the left and I'm on the right, we can have a liberal society in which we treat one another well and we
Liberty.
argue.
We want freedom.
It's from liberty, and it's
Yeah.
the idea that go ahead and read Karl Marx. That's not a bad thing to read that. Even if our country is founded on capitalism and he was advocating something else, liberalism says explore ideas in a civil setting. But now liberalism is bad left, right? Liberal is from one side of the country, a bad word, and they've now responded to it that way too. And so, and it's the same way with progressive. There's contexts in which you would say, I feel like your temperament is progressive, right?
Okay.
We've had
Yeah.
that conversation.
No,
But there's another setting when it gets attached to political things that's only negative now. So I don't know how it happens, but it's not just conservative. That is, the title is a former adjective that now applies and it doesn't fit in a sense.
Right. Well, and that's why it's confusing times, I think.
Yeah, that's true. But I
So what
I
do you,
think
what
it was
do you
always
going
that
back to
way.
the quote? What do you think of this idea that our role in society as leaders
Okay.
is to always be on the attack?
This is a great question because this is something I was thinking about. Let me modify it with this idea: salt and light.
Yeah.
That's not really attacking. Salt is a preservative. You are the salt of the world. That's a preservative function. And
Well,
the light
it's
one,
attacking if you go and are salting things.
There is,
Where's
yeah,
the
I
salt
don't know.
put, right?
Okay,
'Cause that's
I agree
missions.
with that, but I don't know that that's in that context. The negative one of salt is those who mistreat children. The least of these in the kingdom. It would be better that a millstone hung around them. And it says they should salt themselves before they're salted.
Okay.
And so the idea there of salting is one of destroying,
Right.
of attack. And they need to salt themselves.
But that's a separate context from...
I agree with it. That's
Okay,
what I'm
okay.
saying. The Matthew 5 one, I don't think is that destroy, attack word. I think it's the preserve context.
Oh, preserve.
Yeah, because in the society of the first century, meat and products, there was no other way. Salt was how you preserve meat so you could eat food that you killed yesterday.
Well, what I
next
mean by
week.
attacking in that context is you're putting salt on things. Here's the meat, we're putting the salt on it.
Yeah.
And that a small amount has a significant impact, right?
Yeah,
And the
yeah.
light in the same idea.
Yeah,
And so therefore, you put a little bit of Christianity into a culture, it should have a big change. But it seems like what we're finding is a lot of Christianity is having a minimal, because we've isolated Christianity away. It's like we're keeping the salt in the shaker, which is a defensive posture is how I'm thinking about it.
well, yeah. So, and the light one is an interesting one because light shines for good and it shines on, the purpose of the light. And Jesus says he put it on a stand. That's what
Yeah.
it was made for. So why would you ever cover it up, is his point. Well, what's it put on a stand for? One, to light the way that you can see for positive. But two, when the light turns on, cockroaches run away.
Yeah, I was going to
There's a
say.
very negative, there's an assault component to light that's inherent in light.
Right.
It is both the good development of vision, but it is also to keep out bad things. So,
Well,
I think
the other
it's-
reason people don't want the lights on is because they don't want you to see what's there.
yeah, that's right.
Right. Which isn't keeping
That's
out
the
the bad
cockroaches,
things.
though.
Right. But I'm saying it's not keeping out bad things. It's just,
Oh, exposing them.
it's keeping them from being noticed.
Yes, that's
Right,
right.
yeah.
Well, the mental imagery, you turn the light on and the cockroaches are scuttling
Yeah.
because they were there all along and they don't want to be seen.
Yeah.
So now they run for the dark corners.
Right.
I think there's a valid point. I just wouldn't want it to. My own response would probably be to not make it an exclusive point. That
Yeah. Which he
if somebody-
definitely did.
Yeah, and I don't know that he even agrees with that. You're telling me that if you went and looked at Patton's history, he never defended anything.
So
doubt
what
that
I
that's
would
the
say
case.
is his philosophy of war was to always be attacking.
I mean, I understand.
So
that.
whenever he had leaders under him
yeah,
who were stopping to regroup,
Yeah.
so there's a tendency among war fighters to, especially in the old school mentality, to line up. We got to get lined up first, and then we'll attack. And even in the most recent, and we think technology is reinventing war, but the impulse to line up is like still there from back in ancient days. And so what people like Rommel and Patton, there's a guy named Boyd who studied war, Sun Tzu, all these guys who were really successful in strategy would say is don't stop to line up. Everybody attacks, and then if you're failing, you back up. If you're succeeding, you advance, and then you let everybody know I'm winning over here, and then the other people will come and attack where you're winning. And so it's this intermixed, cooperative assault. You might need to retreat, but you're never stopping to wait for someone to catch up. And so when he got stopped in World War II because they didn't have fuel or we needed to wait for resources, he was furious because it was always advancing.
So I think one of the things that modifies this too, in my mind, I think the point is good. I think you like it personality-wise, which is not a bad thing.
Yep.
But I also think that there's some, I'll call it gospel, tripping up all of natural mindedness. The gospel, I think, could agree with what you're saying. And it also would do so in such a way that it would trip up the natural thought to go gung-ho only with that mindset.
Yeah.
Because the gospel says, here's what I'm going to win. I'm going to win when you nail me to a cross. That doesn't look like attack. You just didn't know that it was. You didn't understand what attack was. So
Yeah,
was
but it was
Jesus-
definitely an attack.
Yes,
Yeah.
and yet not perceived in the world as such.
No, but
was perceived that
if
he
you were
was
going to
attacked.
accomplish that as a strategy, you would have to have an aggressive mindset, right? That Jesus set his face like flint.
Oh, well, so I agree
go
with
and
you.
accomplish
That's
it.
right. I totally agree. And he was willing to turn over the table in the temple. And there were these things he did when he tells parables as the escalation develops with his audience. The Pharisees begin to say, we want to put him to death. And he doesn't back down is not the right word. He doesn't shy away from continuing to say what's going to lead to his death. And in
And
that
he would
sense,
still retreat, right? When it was needed,
strategic.
until it was the right time.
He left an area because it was hot and it wasn't the right time. It wasn't his time.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying the gospel, in a sense, I think probably agrees, but has this wrinkle that you could never just take it as this ambitious endeavor, moral majority type of assault on society. You'd also always have to work in this gospel, but death and our suffering and our sorrow and an apparent defeat, because God's working an assault that layers over partly what we think and partly does it exactly the opposite. We'd never do it this way.
But I agree with what you're saying, and and then I vehemently disagree on this other side.
I know what you're saying.
It's like churning in me, and this is the idea that a martyr whose posture is one of surrender to evil, it's like it diminishes its value. Whereas to say, I'm defeating evil by dying today, and with all my strength, right, and the Spirit giving me life, I stand and accept this
so
death.
you don't want anything that sounds like defeatism, right?
I do. I agree, and I think there's a connection too, in the sense that, and I didn't think this topic would get this big, but in the sense that we were talking about the difference between an established Christian culture and how sour it can turn, right? Mm-hmm. To me, that feels like a defense. Mm. When Christianity gets on the defense and says, now we got to protect our territory and make sure everybody does their job, and like we create solid policies around everything. It's like, okay, all that stuff is needed. You need managers, but the kingdom of heaven advances, and the managers and the establishment serve the advancement, or they just start to serve themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what he's saying, is when Christianity stops attacking, even if you're in the reserves, even if your job is the supply line, you serve the attack. And when you stop serving the attack and you say, hey, this is my turf over here.
But what do you mean by attack? Let me give an illustration. I'll ask a couple questions. Is, in your mind, let's not dispute about the Catholicity of Mother Teresa, but Mother Teresa going to India and Calcutta and serving the lepers, is she attacking?
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah,
I think she is attacking. But it certainly is not this warfare, aggressive, take back the heights of culture. Do you know what I'm saying? It is a serving and lowliness.
Culture is just one expression of Satan's dominion or attempted thwarting of Christ's lordship, right? Yeah. People sick and dying is another.
Yeah.
And you see that Jesus assaulted in both fronts, right?
Yeah.
So absolutely.
So what I hear you saying by that is, if you always have examples of the poor or these kinds of things that aren't the cultural dynamics, is that what you're feeling frustrated by? That there's no cultural dominance being expressed, only serving the poor and whatnot?
No, I'm just saying that when Christians stop attacking, they get selfish and spoiled, and it sours the gospel, and then it becomes really narcissistic.
Yeah, but I think when you say the word attacking, it's unclear what that means.
Oh, okay. So attacking means attacking the works of the enemy, right? So advancing the gospel to unreached people, taking Christianity to people who've never encountered God.
Okay.
Right? So that might be people in our community who just don't really know what Jesus is, who he is, and what he's about. It might be, it's anywhere that Satan claims dominion that we take it back. That can be in our own hearts. But to say, okay, we got it, like let's fortify, is the beginning of your demise. So what I continually find in my devotion is that the strategies and the mentality of the best warriors applies to spiritual domain and the way that God wants us to be.
Okay, I would push back on that.
Okay,
I won't disagree with it, but I want to infuse it with another dynamic.
Yeah.
And that is, so you and I are gonna agree that Jesus exemplified the best warrior, right?
Yes.
And so in a sense, if we asked just 1,000 or 100,000 people what is a warrior, they're going to all like the picture of Jesus and the whip that he braided together and went into the temple and overturned. They're going to say, yes, warrior.
Yeah, but that's just the
when he
that's
slapped,
the minor physical aspect.
I
And
know.
most of that whip was to drive out animals anyway. But what I'm saying is, if you could, like, remember we talked about seeing things in a spiritual dynamic, right? What would the gun look like if you could see it in its potential power
Yeah.
in the spirit realm?
Yeah.
I think that's true of all the good works we do
I agree with you.
in Christ.
I agree.
Right? That it's like war, but your
I agree
heart,
with
your
you
mentality.
completely.
If your mentality then applies to the physical and says, "Oh, we're going to beat people for Christ," that's not going to work.
Right.
And I think if you think that means on the outside it'll look like you're winning all the time, that's also not true,
Right.
Because it looked like Jesus was losing
That's right.
on the cross, but he knew he
right.
wasn't.
That's right. He
Right.
knew.
And when we're doing it well, when we're walking with God, I think we'll know too. And I think if I had anything perspective as far as Mother Teresa, for example, as she was, as far as I know, well known for being intensely discouraged for decades
She was
in her
that's
ministry,
correct.
right?
That's right.
So what was she not seeing? Was she not seeing that spirit realm? Was she not seeing God's vision for what would be accomplished through her life? Was she being thwarted in her beliefs that Satan was tormenting her with doubts and condemnation and too much focus on her own sin? Was she falling into this? I've got to fortify back and I've got to establish my lines in a spiritual way. I don't know. I don't know who she was.
And
right?
I wouldn't even go so far as to say when her expression of discouragement, I wouldn't necessarily cast that in a negative light even, or try to find reasons for it that it shouldn't have been there. I would say that.
I mean, 40 years of discouragement. I think you're missing a piece.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think that Wilberforce faced a lot of discouragement. Adoniram Judson faced a lot of discouragement. So much depression, he went and lived by himself for 3 years in a hut after his wife died.
Yeah.
And he had no. So all these people that we look at and can call a hero of the faith, because we have an end of the story and we look at them also through an eye of faith. In the middle of it, I don't know that you always see all that.
I'm not saying that the dark night of the soul is not a legitimate. Like I experienced it myself.
It could be a dark week too.
Could be a dark year. Could be several.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I think there's a point where the enemy's goal is to take you out of the fight,
Yeah.
and that's what that is.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
if
and
you
so
are,
that would
if you're
be my
stuck in a
point.
hut, you're not in the fight.
Well, not necessarily.
I
Mother
mean-
Teresa, for example, she never quit, right? She didn't give up. She didn't
Right.
leave. So in a sense, even though she reports these sentiments and feelings, I would say she continued to battle. I would want to take your words of attack
Yeah.
and say she did it, even though it could look like in aspects that she didn't. The truth is she did.
You can still fight when you're wounded.
That's right.
Yeah,
And it's not even, okay, so even when you say it that way, that sounds like, you would want this big thing, but you're wounded and so you give a small thing. I would say the opposite. When you're wounded in the appearance of the eyes of the world, for Christians, it's actually more fight is going on. When you obey and you continue, even if your efforts seem weaker, Paul argues, when I am weak, then I'm strong. I'm given a messenger in the flesh. I have problems. He didn't say problems. When I am appearing to be defeated, then I am actually most strong.
Right.
And he says earlier in the letter, he goes, we were so discouraged. We thought we were going to die. But that was to force us to rely on God. And here's an interesting phrase, who raises the dead.
Right.
Which what I think he means is, I didn't think we're going to make it.
Right.
And if I don't think I've finished what God wants me to do. And so that must mean maybe he's going to raise me from the dead.
Well, and
that's what I'm hoping.
I think more discouraging than the potential death and suffering that Paul faced was his expression of abandonment by the people that he invested in. Right? That he's discipling these men, that he's leading these churches, that he's planting, he's going to places where people hate him, and at the end of his ministry, maybe Timothy's all he has left, right? And he thinks it was all for nothing. How discouraging would that be?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm there with you.
I think what you're trying to say and is this being on the offensive. And I think what I'm trying to say is that shouldn't look like how the world would define offensive, because the gospel ends up redefining all these words so that what looks like it's retreat in the eyes of our flesh, not just the world, but what even us, actually God turns into offense. So that the cross, the biggest defeat you could imagine for the Messiah, is finally, God's help finally came. And he just got killed by the world powers, invisible and visible.
Right.
Looks like the biggest defeat, but it wasn't. It was the exact opposite. So that I think your point, I agree with your point, being on offensive. I just want to constantly work for my benefit of mind that what does that mean? Otherwise, I'm going to too quickly run to the things that I would by nature rely on as offensive.
Like, what are my indicators of success?
That's right. And I would not say Adonai Jits. I don't think going into, when he went, by the way, when he went for that 3 years by himself and retreated, didn't leave, he translated most of the Old Testament. Because he kept working, but he thought he was done. He was so discouraged.
Right.
But I think the hindsight looks at it and says, there was a purpose that God had he didn't see.
So I'm hearing you say that's, to me, that's more than how the world sees things, right? Because when you say it that way, I don't care.
Yeah.
I don't care what the world thinks
Except
about
that you and I, by nature, think the same way when we have to fight it.
Well, and that's where I'm hearing you too, is that even when you're fully pursuing God's will, when you're engaged in the work of spiritual war, when you think you're losing, you still might not be.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
That's cool.
And the opposite is true. When you think you're winning, you might not be. I'll tell you, I have preached sermons when I thought the Lord was with me, man. And you get a comment here and there, and it's just been the funniest things. I've preached sermons when I just thought that was the worst thing. You just want to crawl under a rock. And then people say these things to you, how moving it was. They say these things, how impact they were. And finally, you just throw up your hand and say, Lord, it's yours. I got nothing to say here. I'm going to keep doing what you told me to do, but I am not a good judgment of what is winning in the spiritual dimension because I keep applying our world assessments to it. And it's not that it's completely false, but it is not all true.
Well, and we've said this before, but even those people's assessments might, they might think it was impacted, but
that's right. That's exactly right.
You don't know what God will do.
That's exactly right. Well,
and that's where you're faithful to
what
throw
if
the
somebody
seeds.
likes what we're talking? This went way past our. We actually pulled in 2 of our future topics.
That's good. That's good. We're making the connections. All right. If you're enjoying this episode, if we're saying anything that is blessing you or making you think again, hit that like button, subscribe. If you're feeling verbose, you can even leave a review. Share it with a friend. Okay. You had some top 10 social media accounts you wanted to talk about.
Oh, no. This was just an observation. Trying to put in something. I just thought it was interesting. I just read an article a few days after the war in Israel breaks out, and somebody noted the top 10 social media accounts in the United States were silent on this warfare.
Yeah.
Except for Kylie Jenner, who has a pro-Israel post. She gets such pushback, she deletes it immediately.
Right.
And then the counter to that is the Ukraine stuff. They've not been silent at all. Now, there's been a more recent, Hollywood has put the signed letter with all these hundreds of people denouncing the Hamas attack and the atrocities. And that's good. But it took 6 days. It took 6 days to do that. And I just think from a pop culture perspective, you just can't get out of, you're in a system. You're in a system. If I agree with you, I've got to agree with you in order for you to like me. Mm-hmm. And there's a narrative that's unspoken, that is goes around, and you know what it is. And in this case, it is to be anti-Israel somewhat and pro-Palestinian, and to talk about if the Palestinians have an atrocity, then to say, well, the oppressors of Israel, and you start using equivalent language to try to make it 50-50. Right. And all these different things, but then when it comes to Ukraine, which is a laundering of money, and there's a whole host of things on the left that's going on with Ukraine, but that's appropriate to support, and you'll get kudos if you support pro-Ukrainian voices as social media.
Yeah, but there's almost no voices in the media in favor of Putin, right? There's people skeptical of why are we sending all this money to Ukraine?
Yeah.
And is it just more embezzling that Biden's been doing for years?
Yeah.
But I don't hear anybody in any kind of mainstream, at least, who's saying we're on the side of Russia.
Nobody is pro-Putin. Anybody who doesn't support the Ukraine road, very few of them are pro-Putin.
But it's crazy to me, the people that are pro-Hamas, right?
Yes, that's another
I learned what Hamas
acceleration.
means. Do you know this?
I do not know.
So it's an acronym in the Arabic, I assume, right? Which is Hamas in Arabic is something like the government of the people of Palestine or something like that. But it's also a Hebrew word, and it means like violent wickedness. So they literally and deliberately, it would seem, formed their government around a word that means to
That's
kill.
one of the differences between Islam and the Judeo-Christian tradition. Islam says it is appropriate to defeat your enemies in the name of Allah by any means possible.
Well,
if
and your
needed.
enemies are anyone who won't submit,
That's right.
because
And
Islam
Christianity
means to submit.
does not do that, and even Judaism did not do that. There was an ethical restraint. There was winning a war, but there was also humanity is preserved in that process.
Yeah, we were studying today at school Just War. I was
Yeah.
teaching them how to take notes, and we were doing science.
Yeah.
And after lunch, I said, "You guys, teaching science after lunch is tough. Teaching anything that requires much brain power on
Yeah.
a Friday after lunch is a challenge." So I gave them a choice. We can study Just War, and one of the things in this sermon, which I didn't agree 100% with what he was saying, but it's fascinating. He said at the beginning, I think a substantial church, raise your hand if you've ever heard a sermon on Just War. And he said there wasn't a hand in the whole place, and I can't think
Yeah.
of a time I have.
Yeah.
If I wanted to know about it, I had to go look it up myself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so we went through what are the criteria
You're
for
talking
Just War.
specifically a sermon, though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like because you're supposed to go to church to hear these teachings, right? I would think.
That's true.
What's church for? Yeah, but here's a question I had about Israel and thinking biblically about this war, and that is, in the Bible, repeatedly, when the nation of Israel turns away from God to worship idols, God brings some form of calamity upon them as his judgment. And even to the point, and I want to say it's in Jeremiah, where the prophet says, if you resist this judgment, this calamity, you're resisting God. Like
Yeah.
this is it.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is from God.
Yeah.
That's an astonishing thing to say in this context today, but I can't think that when Assyria or Babylon are attacking Israel, right, or even the local whomever, warlords during the book of Judges, I can't think they weren't doing all the same horrible things that we're seeing happen today,
That's right.
With
That's
to
right.
babies, to women, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in ancient times, what
Yeah.
restraint did they have? None.
Yeah.
And yet nobody is saying anything of that. I mean, even if you were to say, and I'm not saying it either as a judgment, I'm not saying this is God, but I'm not saying it's not either.
I know.
Because the call of calamity, the purpose of calamity in the Bible to come on the people who are supposed to serve God, who are called to repent, is to initiate that repentance. So why isn't anyone in Christianity saying these evil things are happening, Israel, because you won't serve the right God? Turn back to him and do what's right. We don't want this to happen to you. We're not supporting Hamas, right? And yet, where's the call to repentance? I don't see it anywhere.
We had this conversation. I don't know if you remember the very difficulty in discerning judgments. When is something a judgment of God that is a call for repentance?
Yeah.
Versus some other, and we talked at that time, for example, I said when I got type 1 diabetes, I explored it and decided it was not this disciplinary and fatherly care of God to correct me.
Right.
I'd had other things
remember
that
that.
were. And I think this is what we get into. This is the same topic. We have to be able to say, I think we should be saying things like that.
We
but
say that about
should.
America.
That's right. 9/11
All the time
was
right
said
now,
of,
right?
And things like that. But there's also fierce pushback when those things are said. The world hates that, and churches even hate it. People said it about the Challenger explosion.
Yeah.
They say about all these catastrophes, the Haiti stuff and the typhoons that took place, earthquakes, New Orleans. We keep saying it about San Francisco predictably, but it hasn't fallen into the ocean yet, right?
It's more likely LA, I think, right?
San Andreas fault.
Yeah.
But the point is, I think we should be saying them, but I also think you have to say it out of a discernment that you think is the Lord, and then you have to stick with it. You have to know why you think it is. You have to know that you're going out on a limb, because here's the thing that we have different. I think you.
But
and
I'm not trying to declare that this is the judgment of God.
I'm not hearing you say that. I'm just saying.
But I don't think I need to. In order to say to the nation of Israel, you need to turn back to God. You've lost your first love. And the way you turn back to God is through Christ. But that alone, to an Israeli, is often considered anti-Semitism, right? The call for Jews to convert.
So that one's, to me, a sticky one then, right? Because you're blending two different difficult topics. The one, when you call a Jew to believe in their Messiah,
Yeah.
and the question of anti-Semitism comes up, in a healthy dialogue, if I'm a Jew and you're a Christian, and I accuse you of that, you would have a right, if we were being civil, for you to say, but I think I'm being actually more Jewish.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And I would disagree, but we could have the conversation. That can't happen. That doesn't happen today, right? In our non-civil setting. So I think that blends in with then, if you have that sticky scenario, and now you have the assaults that are terror, that are, the gruesomeness of it also escalates the ability to have a dialogue.
Well, and I think what I'm hearing people argue about is like, should Israel retaliate and defeat their enemies? That doesn't, their retaliation doesn't bother me.
It
right?
doesn't bother me either.
I don't support war crimes, and if there are any, they should be prosecuted, right? But to the extent that they need to establish safety for their people, I'm totally along. But what I've seen among Christian leaders, not only that support, but this bloodthirsty call for war, right? That we need to engage even as America in their war. But nowhere is the Christian message mixed in. It's the strangest thing. It's like the Christian message to the Jews and to the Muslim is come to God. He created us. You've received a false teaching. You've missed his Messiah. Repent.
Yeah.
And so when calamity befalls anyone, the call to repentance is a natural step.
You might not like what I'm about to say.
Okay.
I expect pushback on it, but I would say that's a prime example of this blending of when we use words that the world's system and we function in that, but then when you have gospel redefinition of them, they become difficult.
Wait, what words?
This idea of that we're supporting Israel going and defeating them, but there's no gospel in our messaging.
Right.
Because the Christian church, I think in America, has forgotten this core wrinkle that changes everything. And they have only run with the ones that are understood by the world at large.
Oh, you lost me. What wrinkle?
Well,
what words?
The wrinkle would be this. Okay, so I'll say it in another way, and it'll show you the wrinkle.
Okay.
You and I just agreed that Israel to strike back and to vindicate and attack Hamas, we agree that's legitimate.
Right. But I would agree with that with any nation.
Okay, that's
There's
fine.
nothing special
That's
about
fine.
Israel that I would
Well,
agree
I
with
wasn't doing it special with Israel.
Okay,
either.
okay. Oh, no, I'm just
And the
clarifying.
reason I agree with it is because the sword is given by God to the state, and
Right.
they have a right to wield it.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, I believe something else, and these two are in conflict with myself. The other thing
okay.
I believe is, as a Christian, the other one has Christianity in it also, but this gospel thing says, I think it's not a good thing. Not that they should not wield the sword, but that the death of anyone is not what God is wanting. It's a horrible thing, whether they're rapists and murderers. And I would say the same thing about the death penalty. I personally believe in the death penalty, but I think as a Christian, it's also legitimate to say this is a horrible thing. This is an evil that is functioning in the world.
So is it?
And this is this gospel wrinkle.
How do you do that? How do you say that without nullifying the Old Testament?
Because the Old Testament is not gospel oriented. The new covenant has not come.
That's crazy to me. Like the Old Testament, rightly understood, is the gospel.
And that is shadows.
Right.
It's
rightly understood.
So it's less than the new. Hebrews is making the argument it was insufficient. So in what ways is it insufficient?
No, the law is insufficient.
But the law that's correct.
Yeah.
But the law is also the covenant of Moses. The law is not just 10 commandments. The law is the whole covenantal structure that was to take Israel and say, walk with God.
The Old Testament is more than Moses.
That's true.
And Abraham, for example, is given as our model to
I agree with
understand
that.
salvation.
That's right.
So he has a covenant with God. His faith brings righteousness.
That's right.
Right.
That's
Okay.
right.
So if rightly understood, the Old Testament leads you to Christ.
I agree with that.
So in that context, God says when people, the bloodthirsty one should be destroyed, right? If you kill a man, your life is forfeit. That's justice. Like, I don't understand how the gospel would lead me away from any of that.
Paul says, the earlier thing, is it John that says something came through Moses and something came through Jesus, grace and truth
That sounds right.
through law?
Yeah.
So there's a distinction. Grace and truth are in Moses, but in the revelation of Jesus, it has come to its fullest light that we're going to see before eternity, I think.
Right.
It was shadowed before, there but shadowed. Paul says, in this new unshadowed reality, we no longer view every man. We view them differently.
Okay.
Something has changed so that we don't view them, he says, after the flesh. Right? In
Okay.
Corinthians. He's talking about being an ambassador. He wants to win everyone. We no longer view them according to the flesh. What
Right.
does he mean by that? I think he means these two dynamics. The old covenant, in its shadowiness, was a flesh, earth-oriented, physicality-oriented. It's not exclusively that. It had spiritual threads through it, and they come and point to Jesus. But it was dominated by the reality of life on earth.
Yeah.
The new covenant takes that and says, these are all images. You still got to live on earth, but now the light of heaven has come, and it's come close, and live in this new way. And it's not easy to see. Everything is turned upside down and crazy.
Right.
So I think what Paul means by that, and I think where it ties to my statement, let's say about capital punishment or Israel, according to the flesh, the state has still been given the sword. It's not unjust. In fact, it is just. But there is another dynamic that has come in. It is not according to flesh.
Right.
Where God says, I want to have mercy. God wants to have mercy on Israelis and Palestinians. God's heart cares for the one who just murdered and beheaded the Palestinian savage that just beheaded the Israeli innocent kid.
Baby. Yeah.
Baby. God, in a sense, we could say, I think, in anthropomorphizing and the way he represents himself, he grieves for the one that was hurt.
Yeah.
And there is, and a reflection of him, of pushing back on the injustice, that's in him too. But right now, the other point I'm going to make is his heart also calls to the one who committed the atrocity, repent before you lose time.
So do you read the new covenant as to exclude from God his wrathful nature?
No.
Okay. Because it's
I know,
sort of
I
what
know,
I'm reading
I
out
know.
of it.
I say that their intention. It's no longer a simple one way to answer something. That's why I've often thought as Christians, we're bipolar people. We have a foot in two kingdoms. We're on
But God
this earth.
can't be bipolar.
I know.
He can't be against himself.
But we live in it.
But how could God be intentional?
I'm not saying he is against himself, but he's asked us to live in two kingdoms now. And those two kingdoms have different principles of viewing the world. And the component of justice, it is connected to the heavenly kingdom, I think, but it's more easily seen by us in the earthly kingdom. And the sword is given to the state. The sword is not given to the church. So we're not to do that.
If this were true, and I'm trying to play it out and kind
yeah.
of process, because this is an aspect of the two kingdom mentality that we've gone around on
I know.
a little bit.
Yeah.
But that would seem then to imply that when Jesus returns, there would be no more sword. But I read the opposite. Jesus returns with a sword.
Okay, two things. I have to know what return you're talking about because you and I could have different eschatologies.
I'm just thinking about when heaven and earth are reunited.
In the last day.
Yeah. The judgment will be established.
So I would say this, the sword, so you're not talking like some premillennial and there's 1,000 years and there's all other stuff.
I'm thinking of the image of the Christ with his eyes of flame.
Yep.
And a sword from his mouth
what
slays
is
his
the sword?
enemies.
Oh, yeah. So what is it, though?
It's his word.
That's right. So
Yeah.
it's actually not the sword that the state carries.
No,
It's
well,
not a
he's the
physical
King of
sword.
Kings.
That's
of
right.
the increase of his government, there will be no end.
Right.
He's establishing his kingdom on earth.
But my point is that what we see there is the finalization of all that we have distorted about this world and made it the earthly kingdoms, of which is the sword to execute God's judgment. He comes along and it has its fuller fulfillment, and that is, it's his word now. It's not a sword. But in all of our way to understand
Wait. It's a sword coming out of his mouth. How can it not be a sword?
Because it's not a sword that you and I could have in the corner of this room. It's not physical. It's in the spiritual, it's his word.
But when Jesus returns, the physical and the spiritual are reunited.
Exactly.
Okay, so it is physical then.
No.
It's physical and spiritual.
Well, okay, I'm good with that as
Right?
long as what that means is the physicality of us understanding the sword got emptied of all flesh and sin and aberration. And now in Jesus, it is what was physical is brought into its healthy relation to spiritual that it has never had. You and I have never, ever once tasted a healthy physical thing connected to spiritual reality.
But that's
it's
not,
all distorted.
Jesus doesn't come with wrath because now everything's made new. Things are made new after he comes with his wrath.
That's correct.
Right? So in that moment of wrath, when he establishes
making.
his supreme authority and said,
Yes.
it was an invitation, now it's force.
That's
right.
I agree.
So in that,
But I don't think the force is he's going to pull a sword off his hip. I think the force is he's going to speak a word and it is more effective than any.
Talk that, because it is what?
It is. That's it.
He speaks a word and his enemies are destroyed.
That's right. By the word of his power.
Right.
Which is how he holds up all creation. So we're not far from where we began. We're actually going back to the restoration of what's been lost.
Okay.
So I think that the sword, there's another sword imagery about on the thigh, right? When he comes with a sword. I think the idea there is that, okay, what if this way, Matthew 25.
Okay.
The sheep and the goats, they come before him and he says, whatever you did to the least of my brother, you did to me.
Yeah.
You did it. All this verbal, I think that's the exact same thing as when he comes with the sword. Exact same thing.
Right.
But viewed in a different picture, so to speak. He's sitting on the throne. Another one would be the scrolls are opened up. The scrolls are the word written down.
Get back to the beginning, because the point is not whether, like, of what material is the sword constructed, right? That's not the point. The point is that he will bring destruction on his enemies in a way that is like, or not that different from, the way Israel is bringing destruction on Hamas right now.
Yes, I agree with this. Yeah,
Okay. So in that way,
he will
there is a
destroy
goodness
his enemies
to what Israel is doing.
I agree.
Okay.
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
But I also think that we are in a gospel age right now in which Israel's enemies could repent.
Yeah.
And so when they are put to death, it is similar to, but not the same as the last day. Because the last day, the age is over.
Yeah, right. The time is up.
God has said, I'm done now.
So the tension is between the will of God that all would turn to him, and the reality that they don't.
That's why I call it a gospel wrinkle that has to invade all of our other pieces.
I got that.
Yeah.
Whereas in the end, because here, one of the things that I remember when this dawned on me, it shook me, is that at the end of time, if Jesus' parable is to be taken as somewhat literal, that the people in heaven will be able to speak to those in hell.
I think that I personally
on some
believe
level,
that
right?
That's accurate.
Okay. So then everyone, whether you're forever in paradise or you are forever in suffering, you will say he did all things well.
So I don't know if the ones in suffering will ever say it, but they will.
They'll know it.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yes. And the verse that is the Puritans used to use is the one in Isaiah, I think it's 66, where it says they look over the pit and it's smoking with the fires of torment or of destruction, and they bow down and worship.
Yeah.
And what Edwards ended up postulating, but people have really disliked this tremendously, but he says that we think of hell now, and we can only think of it in sorrow and loss and negativity. But there will come a day, and if we say otherwise, we're pretending.
Okay.
But there will come a day when we will bow before God to the justice, that there's a beauty in his justice.
Yeah. Yes.
And that we will worship for even the destruction of his enemies and let's just not get into the eternality of hell debate, but let's just assume it, the eternal destruction in hell.
Yeah.
That he'd say, we will even rejoice. Now, the problem is people hear that and they freak out. And I understand that. I was far too easily embraced by this idea when I was young.
Yeah.
And then you have kids and you get older and you really think eternal is a horror.
And you're not always certain where your kids will end up.
That's exactly right.
And
so
you have
now
loved ones and you have,
I realize while I still believe that, My heart can't see that. And to say I'm happy with that teaching is stupid.
Right.
I'm not, but I'm not right.
But the same thing is, you could say the same thing for yourself, and maybe it's a little easier to chew. You know, how many people have suffered through terrible things, and at the end, with God's grace, said it was for my
We
good.
see pictures of it.
It was for my good.
That's exactly
I
right.
wouldn't trade it
and
if
I
I
think
could.
those are right pictures.
Yeah.
And they can be very intense ones. The person who wants to object, though, there's two people. There's one who, by their sensitivities, if they say, but eternal, you're right. It escalates it out of the orbit of the miniature examples on earth.
Yeah.
The other one who have objections to it are the ones who the love of God and God as our Father is so persuasive and powerful of an image to them, they can't get out of how God, as a father, you can't conceive of doing that to one of your own children, no matter how aberrant they became.
Right.
And so how can we put into God the destruction of his enemies when those enemies were his children? He says, I'm a father and I care about them. And they just can't go there. And I understand what they're trying to protect and can respect it. I'm just willing to live in a tension plane saying, I don't understand, but I think the other is true also.
To me, because when I imagine, right, that scenario you're describing, of course this can't happen, but if you were the judge who must condemn your own son.
Yeah.
There's love for my son, obviously, that resists that.
Yeah.
But it must be overcome by a love for justice.
I agree with you. This is the
and
Washington story.
I think the flaw that we face in our country, in our culture right now, is we don't love justice.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
And there's the innocent side of that, or the healthy side, with some people who have a high love for mercy and love, and that's good. But there is the far broader, there's a hatred of justice, actually.
If you understand it rightly, like if we see God more like he really is, and I think of is it the Shema, that he's slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness.
Well, the Shema is love the Lord your God with all your heart.
Yeah, you're right. So, but that description of him,
The Micah
I think
6:8.
And I think it's in the Ten Commandments,
to love
maybe,
mercy,
right?
to do justice, to love.
No, I'm just thinking of the description of the Father.
Okay.
That he's slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness.
Okay.
That he pours out a blessing to 1,000 generations of those who love him, right?
Yeah.
When you understand that rightly, then his anger is all the more powerful.
That's exactly right.
I used to talk to kids as a principal. As a principal, it's a lot easier to hold my anger than it is as a dad, because my own ego gets tied in as a dad. And I was frustrated with that often. And I think most dads are.
Yep.
But I remember talking to a kid who was deliberately victimizing a smaller and a younger student.
Yeah.
And I said, have you ever seen me angry? Right? Because I'm very, I used to do everyday assemblies. I'm out in front of the kids. I'm in the halls. I want them to know that I care about every single one. I know their names. So that then in that moment, when that anger flares, that it carries with it something that they've never imagined.
Yeah.
Because many of them, either their parents are absent or their dad's always angry, or never angry. I want it to be that.
Yeah.
And I think that I was trying to be like God. That I was literally reading that and saying, okay, that's how I want to be.
Yeah.
Slow to anger.
Yeah.
But when I'm angry, it matters.
In a fantasy book, Patrick Rothfuss, he says there's 3 things to fear or something like that. And one is the wrath of a gentle man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's an astute point, the wrath of a gentle man.
But that's the
what we're
different,
talking about.
I think that's what biblical meekness is.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Right? Versus the wrath of a man who's beat down and whipped and discouraged and given up and let his wife run everything and his boss at work. And
so
all
meekness,
he does is bend
we
his
should
back
probably
and
explore
try
it
to
at
be
some point
obedient.
because this ends up touching on this, right? Because Moses is called the meekest man on earth.
Yeah.
He's also gets angry quite easily. There's and he's also one of these storylines where, and there's several of them in Scripture where it looks like defeat has taken his life.
Yeah.
And he looks back and says, it wasn't. I thought it was even. He doesn't want to come when the burning bush. He's given up.
Right.
He's not. He's over.
And that's the beginning of his ministry.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
That's
when
what I'm
he's
saying,
80
this
years
gospel wrinkle, that defeat in certain terms, the gospel comes and flips it and turns it into victory.
Right.
And we have we either want, what we want to do, what I would say this, what we're inclined to do is agree with Moses. He was going to deliver this people. God, he thought God called him, and God did. And
You're talking about young Moses.
Young Moses.
Yeah.
But that's flesh. And
Right.
it makes sense to us, though. We resonate with this. Now, as Bible people, we look on the Moses story and say, well, we agree with what God done. But we sure don't like it if it gets reflected in our life.
Right.
And we run towards the internal meanings of young Moses for deliverance.
Right.
And we don't, it's very more difficult for us to see that God's going to do deliverance, but he's going to reinvest it with other dynamics. Now, Moses is still going to do some of the things that young Moses would have been called. He has to stand before Pharaoh.
Right.
He has to say no. He has to do all these things that call, what I think I'm hearing you say in these many episode discussions is the loss of those dynamics of courage and of bravery and of boldness and of these things that are required.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. But then I think that the gospel is always going to twist them to be areas in which they'll never manifest them the ways. And this is where I think I end up differing with Christian nationalism. I hear them manifested in culturally dominant ways that are no different than what the left's doing, is just with a different truth center.
Right. So I see that. I've thought about that too. I don't have a clear, like, part of what I'm trying to chew on as I read about more of this is like, how do the rules differ? But going back to the Old Testament, right? If I look at the Old Testament commands, if I look at how Gideon handles idol worship in his community, is he goes and tears it down.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In the dark of night, because he's
Yeah.
scared of what would happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
That's
sounds
true.
like a guerrilla tactic to me. And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, what's, you know,
Yeah.
to me, it's not saying, oh, that's the manual for how to do things, but it's also saying it's not off the table. And I don't know, what's the threshold for
I
that?
agree. And where I would say this, one example of this, it comes into, which I know partly animates you. Part of your argument is, look, if you saw somebody being stolen off the street, a kid being molested, you'd step in
Right.
and physically stand in the way of this. Right.
Yeah.
And so there's this indignation that would cause you to act. And that's similar to the Gideon thing. I think where that faces questions is not questions about negatively, but questions about how do you do this, is the whole Operation Rescue illustration when abortion first came along, and this would be MLK, where they do this passive resistance. They're in a culture that they're not, this would be the difference between bombing an abortion center,
Right.
or walking on your hands and knees praying outside, willing to be arrested if need be, and being passive.
Which is where we are right now.
Well, but I'm saying
multiple protesters for abortion clinics in the U.S. are being charged with federal prison.
I know for
right now.
Yeah, but they were
on
in the
their hands and
80s
knees.
too.
Yeah.
I know. But my point is, and there has been an actual increase in the kinds of not the kinds of people. There's been an increase in the numbers of people who have been willing to entertain, I should blow it up.
Yeah, it's on the rise.
Not a lot, but it's on the rise from what it used to be.
Doesn't take very many.
Yes. And so, but to me, that's that difficulty of the Gideon story. What is our gospel calling? Is it like Gideon to tear down and we should blow up the evil place? I
Right.
sometimes feel that in my soul. I feel I wish I could write a story about some sniper, elite sniper, and he has 3 friends and they never tell anybody what they do, because
Right.
once you start talking about it, you're trackable. And by an elite strategy, they go across and they...
It's like a Jason Bourne novel for Christians.
That's right. Here's how far I've speculated. They get an EMP.
Oh, there
They
you go.
set off an EMP, and for 1 hour, there's no tracking of anything, and they go and they leave manifestos that say, you woke people destroying our country. You elite people trying to destroy. We're under invasion, by the way.
You sound like
this
a
is point.
Unabomber. You know that, right?
It is similar to this. He was facing the same thing
He
not
was.
as a Christian.
Yeah.
But anyway, because you know what? The Israel stuff, the Hamas stuff, is a border issue as well. And I think it's been right. Some on the right are starting to say, listen, folks, wake up. We are letting terrorist people into our country by the thousands and thousands and thousands right now. And this is not just an open border, but it's an act of war and it's a crime by our current political people.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. I just saw Tucker thing today, and he called it a crime. And I think that's right. So in my fantasy novel, the people make-believe novel, they have this EMP, they can't be tracked, and they manifest it, and it says, we're going to kill one of you a week until you stop these criminal things, right? I think there's a little bit of justice in Mike that has those thoughts, and there's a little bit of flesh in Mike,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And what I think Mike is called to is something in that is a true indignation. But there's then this also gospel thing that is, and I'm not saying I've ever had these thoughts about Nancy Pelosi. It's probably a little risky to start saying names, but I remember the time when I realized it was after the 2020 that God wants Nancy Pelosi to become his child.
Right.
And I had slipped into and didn't realize it. We wrestle with flesh and blood. I was so angry by the things happening. And I had gone too far into my citizenship on earth.
I mean, that might be true. And, that's between you and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
I do have in my head, though, I think of Paul, the apostle, standing in front of Sergius Paulus with the Bar Jesus, the sorcerer, twisting every word and corrupting the gospel. And he rebukes him in fury and strikes him blind and says, you son of the devil, right? I think again, it's just not off the table. There are people who are deliberately, actively pursuing an antichrist agenda.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's Nancy Pelosi. I assume it is, just based on her politics, but I haven't really followed her, to make that kind of personal statement.
Well, the rabid destruction of our borders is an evil crime.
Correct. And it's one blatantly for political gain.
That's right.
Right? That we're going to bring in these future voters.
It's just evil.
Yeah.
Well, boy, we haven't made it very far. Anything else you want to cover?
I thought we did pretty good.
No, I mean, we had a good discussion, but our little checklist.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going through it. I would say the thing I was thinking about, we talked about the World Economic Forum speaker. We didn't talk about it, but I alluded to it. And this was a talk. I listened to part of it. It was happening somewhere in Europe.
Yeah,
saying COVID didn't bring in the Great Reset like we thought.
Yep.
And climate change isn't catching traction either.
Yep.
It really needs to be a water crisis.
Yeah.
And it's like they're plotting like a James Bond villain.
Yeah.
Like, how are we going to overthrow the world?
Which is crazy because I think debt has a capacity to do it more than anything, but you can't say debt's our passionate issue, everybody. Right?
I mean, if
you have to have some positive agenda.
If the world abandons the U.S. currency like it's doing, our debt's going to come due, and it's going to be a bad season.
It's
going
to be for the whole world. It won't just be us.
That's right. Well, and what goes along with it is what we're seeing, which is the end of the state, the peace that America brings with its military. I mean, whether it's a good peace or not.
Let me ask this. OST, on second thought, what do you take with that point? I saw the same article. I noted the same things you noted. You noted it with irony. You noted it with a smile. You noted it with like, this is so stupid. But what do we take away from it?
Well, what I take from it is, and I think the final culmination will be the alien invasion. Like they're gonna put forward something. The aliens are here. We have to unite. We've got some good aliens and some bad ones, right? And the good ones are gonna help us. And boy, they look a lot like those ancient gods that we used to worship, right? And man, if only we didn't have Christianity in the way. I think it all is conspiring. So
you
from
see
the same
it as
source.
Helping to discern the end times unfolding in a sense.
Yeah. I did hear someone say we're almost 2.5 years to the day, and I don't exactly, because I don't study Revelation, but from the Abraham Accords to right now, and Israel being attacked, and somebody joked, what if Elon Musk says, "Hey, I've got the peace plan for the Middle East," and he rises up and declares himself the Antichrist?
That's funny. So
but
that is that's the background I grew up in, but that's not my end times perspective. So I don't end up when I saw that's not where my thoughts end up going about discerning the end times.
Okay, so let me ask you this, and without getting into eschatology
I don't want
and a
to
giant
do either
explanation.
Yeah.
Do you read the Bible to say that whatever the man of lawlessness and the Antichrist and a rising in power, that that's a behind the scenes thing, or that's a literal person we'll be able to point to and say that's the guy?
I'm not sure that there is a little person or that's a figurative language for
Like it's a spiritual being.
yeah, maybe a spiritual being, but it also can be, in my understanding, can just be a descriptive of the way evil works. There's the world, the flesh, and the devil, and in the flesh, there is a manifestation of persons, people that are lawless, that are a man of sin. That sin is a descriptor of them rather than any kind of good. So I don't necessarily see that there has to be an individual for that descriptor to be a description of how.
But even then, you're not saying there won't be. You're just saying you're not looking for it.
I'm just not saying there couldn't have been 10 already.
Right, because there have been many antichrists that have come, right? And Antichrist is, how does it say? It's already come.
That's right. That kind of language.
But when I read that, I think, okay, there's a spirit who's taken on this role of standing up and say, I'm against what Christ represents. And now that spirit is looking on the earth for someone to represent him. And in the end, there will be the one.
There may be some final larger than life figure that all the others have pointed to. That's possible.
Right.
Or it may be that it's just meant to say, this is always going to be manifesting itself unto the very last.
Well, and what's interesting is reading back and remembering to some extent, a lot of people in the late 80s were thinking this is it, right? But the late 80s was right after tons of turmoil in the 70s in the Middle East. And so it sort of feels like we're just repeating this stuff.
World War II people thought it was the end of the world.
Sure.
They saw more signs than we see now.
Yeah. Have you ever read about what Europe was like around the year 1000? Mm-mm. It was like plagues rolling everywhere. There was dictators and kings rising up trying to take over Europe. Like all these things you would have thought Jesus coming back.
Exactly.
Plus, it was actually the millennium.
Yep.
And so it actually, you could read the Bible and say, oh, it's 1,000 years, just like it said, and here it comes.
Y2K.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I look at that, the water crisis, what it does for me is reminds me that to look beneath the crisis, to whatever is the crisis. When the people say there's a crisis, what I end up thinking to myself is, okay, well, maybe there's some kind of problem here.
There's always problems.
But I am not going to believe that this is the end of the world.
Well, and the thing that more important than the end of the world, I think, is to understand the nature of Satan's temptation. Like he said to Christ, I'll give you all the nations of the world. And we talked about this. Yes, Alexander the Great, right?
That's right.
Or all these. There's always somebody out there who's thinking, I could really take this thing. I could get the whole world, right?
Yeah.
There's always somebody.
Yep.
And when we understand that impulse is always sitting, and there are a handful of people in the world that is a realistic possibility,
Yeah.
Maybe far-fetched on some level, but possible.
Yeah.
It's not possible for you or me.
And so what I end up doing with that idea is that I often go back to Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain?
Yeah.
The rulers, they conspire against the Lord and his anointed, but he laughs at them. Mm-hmm. And then the end of it is a warning, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way. So what I take from that is that, okay, Mike, calm down. All of these things are attempts at power that the world is after. The nations are after. The rulers, both physical and spiritual, are after.
Yeah.
And they're not going to end. And when this one is over, there'll be a different one. Don't get caught up in this, Mike. Don't get fearful about it. Because here's the thing, on the COVID one had more fear, at least for maybe 6 weeks. But then it went away, in my opinion. But it stayed for 2 years for a lot of people, right? That this is the end of the world.
Yeah.
And you could say the same. There are still people, climate change today, who think the world is ending. And I just don't believe that's true. I don't even think not only the science, but I don't think it is. I think it is a theft of power.
Well, and the scientists are now beginning to speak out more and say, look, the politicians got a hold of this thing and ran off with it, right?
I would have no problem saying that the stewardship of our earth, since the Industrial Revolution, we need to learn from some of the things we do.
Yeah.
I'm good with that.
Yeah.
I'm good with that. So strip mining coal may not be the best way to mine a resource.
Right, or to power our electric cars.
Right, that kind of thing. But that these things aren't given to us as resources, I have no problems with that. I just think we should be wise in how we do them.
So the other thing it reminds me of is, and there's a concept that comes from some leadership book in the 90s, I don't remember where, but everybody has a circle of awareness, right? And different people have a different awareness. We want to read about the world, right? Some people only think locally.
Yeah.
But you then have a circle of impact that's significantly smaller.
Yeah, that's right.
And the more time you spend thinking about those things that you're aware of that you cannot impact,
Yeah.
the worse your mental health will be.
Yeah.
And one of the things
that's
when
true.
we're seeing this massive increase in mental illness among especially the young, is that they've been beaten down with these giant issues, climate change, right? Sexual identity and
Overwhelmed with them.
racism, and it's these giant problems that they
Universals.
cannot fix.
That's right.
And so
That's
they're
right.
always thinking about things that are
That's
outside
correct.
of their circle of influence, and it creates anxiety because
right.
it's like there's a problem and I can't fix it.
Yep.
And
I
then
agree with you.
it creates a helplessness
Yeah.
that makes
It
you
feels
vulnerable
overwhelming.
to manipulation.
I agree.
And it's evil.
And giving up power.
And that's right. That's right. Which is that type of
Now,
manipulation.
here, we're really right at a 60-minute mark. We might be a few minutes over. This lends itself into my civic revelation, but you make the call if you want to do this, because I don't know how far this will take us. Do you want me to say any of this?
Well, I feel like we touched on it already, so go into it and let's see if we can get
Okay.
a little bit out of it.
All right. Well, this was the point I told you. I heard your name this last week.
Oh yeah. That's
All right. So I'm going to conceal the specifics. I don't think it's appropriate to share that. So I'm going to invent a false story about an illustration. Okay.
Okay.
So I was in a civic setting, a civic conversation.
Yeah.
And let's just pretend that I was at a local high school, and I was on maybe a school board or maybe a library board or something like that. And
Attended a city council meeting. Yeah.
yeah, it could be any. I'm just trying to
all
make
right.
it a small thing rather than city council feels really big, right?
Oh.
But it's a civic thing like that. So I'm in a setting and I'm in a conversation with a group of people, and I'm there in order to have my opinion on what should happen, right? I'm part of a group. Well, this is where your name comes up, by the way, in the real setting that I'm not going to talk about online, or on air. But you were quoted
Oh.
a few times, positively.
Oh, that's good.
And you were quoted in terms of, we want to be, you were quoted in terms of the idea that in a setting in which you have responsibility, you should make a protective environment. Let's just say the kids, okay?
Yeah.
Some of this is made up and some of this is on the real.
Okay.
But let's say you were quoted at the school board meeting. Let's say it was on a school board. And that you had said some things, and it was along this idea that school needs to be a place that protects kids.
Sure.
And let's say we'll have a second dynamic. School needs to be a place where parents are still parents, okay?
All right.
Now, your comments came in another setting that you're involved with, a civic setting, right? So anyway, here I am, I hear this, and I just thought, oh, this is interesting. In a sense, this is what Luke is trying to drive at with Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sitting here in this setting, and I'm hearing his thoughts being quoted
Right.
as advocate, and you're advocating for something that comes from your Christian roots, right?
Yeah.
Now, here's what I found interesting. First of all, that was, eye-opening is not the right word. It was a little bit of a revelation in a couple of ways. One is like, oh, this is what he's feeling, right? We can sometimes have the discussion on those bigger universal, like Christian nationalism for the nation.
Yeah.
But we really, neither of us live there, right?
Not yet.
We're kind of speculating past where we are, and it's not bad,
Right.
but it's not all the way healthy, right? It exceeds.
we are vulnerable to that same
We're vulnerable to the exact same
circle
thing.
of awareness.
Yeah. So, but in any case, it was a good thing. So I, in a sense, witnessed influence having influence,
Right.
or words having influence, right?
Yeah.
And it had one of the components that was shaping this discussion I'm in, right?
Okay.
And so I thought, well, that's interesting. I was going to tell you about it. And then I thought I'd say, okay, so I thought, actually, this is really good. Now, we just had another Christian nationalism conversation today, just on a different front, right? Mm-hmm. But, and so we still have places where you and I kind of trend in different directions. And when we try to hash them out, we kind of say, I see what you're saying, but it's maybe not where we would go as an individual. But so I thought, I wonder if there's a difference between Christian nationalism and Christian service. And if we're trying to get out of a larger debate, is Christian nationalism a debate that includes many topics that in our sphere of life we may not run into. Because when I sat there and had that little revelatory moment, I thought, but I don't feel like I'm being a Christian nationalist sitting here. I feel like I'm being a Christian and I'm serving in some way.
Yeah.
Now my Christianity comes with me. It
Right.
can't not come with me.
Yeah.
And then I ran into this other dilemma.
Well, wait. I think it can not come with you, in the sense that
Oh, I agree. People,
I feel the impulse often to always explain my beliefs without really making it about Jesus.
okay,
right?
that's where I'm going to
it's
go.
And I think, oh, I'm being more persuasive when I do that in my mind. But on the other side, there's this little tinge of like, oh, I'm a little embarrassed to make it the reason I think this is the Bible. Do you know what I mean?
I this is exactly where I was going to go because I experienced that exact same thing.
Right.
When I was sitting there in this meeting, I responded in a way you probably wouldn't have liked because I retreated back to theistic perspectives,
Sure. Okay.
not Christian.
I'm mad already. No, I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah,
kidding.
yeah. And because this was public policy that
Yeah.
was being talked about that would apply to a large area of people, of which there would be Christians and non-Christians. And what I noticed in myself, I still have to carry my Christianity with me. I think there would be some people who said, JFK famously says, my Catholicism will have nothing to do with being president.
Right.
I don't agree with that. That's impossible,
Yeah.
in my opinion. But
Well, it didn't have anything to do with his fidelity to his wife, so maybe it's
that's
possible for
true.
him.
well, yeah, we have to agree. You're right. It is possible, and that's what you and I would both disagree with.
Correct.
That shouldn't
Yeah,
be.
we're on the same page there.
So we're on the same page here. But then, where we would end up parting ways is you might be persuaded, at least I think, that when you give your reason for a policy, you might say you're supposed to anchor it explicitly because Jesus says such and such.
I wouldn't say it as a should.
Okay.
So in my experience and my training, really, I've trained myself and been trained to, for example, use research evidence to to argue that divorce is destructive for kids.
Okay.
But
That's where I inclined.
And I don't think that's
in that
wrong.
setting. In that setting.
Because it's
Not
more,
in the
it is
church.
persuasive.
Yes.
What I'm trying to reprogram myself toward, and this is, I think, the Christian nationalism influence on some level.
Yeah.
I don't know exclusively. There's also just an evangelism strategy to it, is to say, well, there's a God in heaven, and He says this, and therefore, I think that's the right thing to do. Even to take out the "I'm a Christian and so I believe," or
Yes.
"I think this is right,"
But
but to just make it
now
a
when you
statement
say
that
it
goes
that
along
way,
with it.
I feel like that's closer to what I've been saying. There's a God in heaven. I hear you saying, appealing to a theistic dynamic of the world that lots of non-Christians acknowledge too.
Sure.
And in a sense,
I mean, it doesn't have to say there is Jesus, the Christ of Nazareth, right? But it's still representing a godly
I agree
understanding
with you.
of the universe.
Well, this is where I was thinking my thought that I've kept saying that a theistic nation versus a Christian nation, because in a theistic nation, you can appeal to the God of the universe. And if you're not a Christian, a lot of people who aren't Christians acknowledge that there's something there, even though they don't necessarily want to conform their life to it. But then they are persuaded, to not steal.
Yeah.
The God who made things, you can't steal.
So there's a concept in I've heard this in sales, I've heard this in like fundraising for nonprofits, and I've heard it in evangelism. Okay. I don't know where it originated, but that people sit on a spectrum of for and against you in any given belief or your organization are supporting you. They might be actively against you.
Okay.
They might be passively against you. They're neutral. They're passively on your side. They're actively on your side.
Okay, sure.
So the goal, we think of the goal like of sharing your faith, is that you take someone, and this is sort of the testimonies, the stories you hear that are so dramatic. This guy was actively against Christ and everything he represents, and now he's actively for. But it's actually perfectly good to say, I want to take this person who's actively against what I believe is right, what I understand about the universe, and make them passively against it. I just want to demoralize them enough in their confidence about their wrong belief that they'll just say, you know what, I'm not going to volunteer. I'm not going to give my money like I was before. I'm not so sure. Or I'm sure, but, right? You're just trying to move them over the scale.
Yeah.
So what I see you describing, and it's not exactly the same thing, but to say, okay, they're a theist. They're on our side. Let's see if we can get them all the way to Christian.
I mean, that would be.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
yeah.
so to get someone to theist is not wrong.
Yeah.
It's not wrong to say there's a God and therefore
and
this
I'm
is
saying,
the way to do it.
I agree with that. I'm saying something a little
just not the
different too.
end.
That I'm saying in public policy, I'm content with theism.
Right.
Because theism will get enough for a civil society in
Yeah.
which there'll be peace. You know, pray for peace. It says, and quietness of life. Paul says.
I don't know if it can get us a civil society, but I would say that I'm not going to fight you on theism until you're the majority. Does that make sense?
I do.
We're
I
on the same
completely
team
agree.
until
So
most
that's-
everybody's over here, and now I'm going to keep
So
pushing
we're
harder.
now allies with Greenwald.
Glenn Greenwald.
Glenn Greenwald,
Yeah.
right? We're far apart in
An
other things.
openly gay, libertine,
That's right.
right?
Extreme
Morally
libertine. Yes.
and yet
there's a
totally
lot of people
against
like
the
that.
authoritarian state that's
right.
conquered the West since COVID.
That's right.
Yeah.
J.K. Rowling, we're on the same side now.
Yeah.
But when the extreme transgenderism craziness goes away, then with Christians and J.K. Rowling, they'll start to sit on a little bit different sides of the fence for a bit.
But okay, so I want to go back to the distinction you made between service and nationalism, right? And I don't think the nationalism is the key to it, except that I'm not a globalist, right? If anything, I would rather say I was a Christian localist.
Sure.
I want governmental decision making to be as localized as possible.
Yes.
And and I've said locally
Yeah.
I'm a liberal.
Right.
Statewide I'm a conservative,
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
wish
yeah.
the Fed would go away.
Yeah.
Okay. Except there's China out there, so it
Yeah.
can't. But other than that, okay.
Yeah.
So the idea, though, of you're saying in that sense, in that public sphere, you felt more like this is just my service.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is Christian leadership. That's what Jesus said when he said, it's not this way in my kingdom as far as leadership goes. We don't lord over people. We serve.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we serve? We serve by leading. That when there's a corrupt issue, we face it,
Mm-hmm.
right? We don't back down. We don't hide away. So if anything, I would say the teaching I got growing up was that we're servant leaders. We lead by serving. I think it's the other way around. I think we serve by leading. And so the leading is not for us. It's not to make a name. It's not to gain power and influence and make sure that our territory is protected. But it is exerting the power, right? If you're a police officer who serves Christ, you use the power you've been given by the state to uphold righteousness, to stop evil.
Okay, so
In the same way, if you're the mayor, if you're the city
Question.
council, the school board.
I'm assuming when you say Christian localism, I like that, by the way.
Yeah.
The only thing you're saying is the largeness of the sphere. There's no fundamental difference between that and what you have advocated for nationalism, right?
Right.
Okay.
Which is also why, like, the father and his family metaphor, I think works really well. To say, I can't make my kids Christian, but I
Yeah.
can raise them in a Christian home
Yeah.
in the hopes
Yeah.
that their hearts will turn toward Christ.
Well, so in that sense, then, in this Christian localism, nationalism thing, would you say when I'm in this civic setting and I did advocate for what would be Christian righteousness in a sense?
Yeah.
So one of the issues, in our analogy, is that in the school, somebody wanted to have pornographic materials in the library.
Yeah.
And I
Welcome to Oregon.
was on a side saying, no, we should be in this different direction.
This is hypothetical.
I'm being hypothetical.
Okay.
here.
No, because if it was, I would
Yeah.
go to the next meeting. Here we go.
So, but I'm trying to pick something similar to what I did. Anyway, the point is that there's this, and I would say, in a sense, the group was in support of the same thing, but trying to articulate it in such a way
Yeah.
as to be wise, as to not create an argument if there doesn't need to be one, but to make sure that this isn't what happens,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And would you say, in a sense, that was your idea of Christian localism, nationalism, is being there to be a part of that discussion?
Your voice is in there. Yeah, I agree.
I
But
have no problem with this, by the way.
yeah, right. I didn't think you did. So I think our only disagreement is the idea that what if the
But I think of
pastor
it as service.
what if the pastor, as part of announcements, is saying, "Hey, there's a school board and they're talking about porn in the library. We should all be down there." I think
don't
that's
have a problem with
I think
that
that's the
either.
active role. And
I wouldn't
versus
like the word
versus if
all,
the
but-
pastor said, "Hey, we're all endorsing this guy for city council." Now it's like, okay, because
Yeah.
is this guy elder qualified? Like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Because that blurs it.
I mean, I would prefer the pastor say, I think many of you are called to do more than you think you are. And many of you should go down and make your voice heard.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you can bind with all, and I don't think you can bind with your service has to look that way.
I'll give you a great story, and then I think we should wrap. There was a church, and it was a small town. I want to say it was Iowa. I don't remember where. And I heard this story, but I'm convinced it's a true story. Okay. local library, small town. They're going to do a drag show for kids,
Okay.
right? And this has been going around. It's Pride Month. And I think this was a year ago, June,
Okay.
during Pride Month. Local church hears about it. Church of about 200 people. The pastor and the elders organize that every adult who can from church is going to go to that event. And they're going to get there an hour early. And they do. They sit, and it's not a big library. It's a small town.
Oh.
They fill every seat. So they sit in there before anyone else has arrived. And now the organizer comes, the drag guy shows up, and it's sort of like, oh, wow, this is full. And then the liberal moms with their kids show up, wanting to expose their kids to this, but now they have to stand around on the wall, on the edges. And so they're about to begin, and the pastor stands up and looks at the librarian and says, I think under the fire code laws, this room is at capacity. I think, in fact, it's beyond capacity. We probably need to have people step out. And who goes to his church? The fire marshal. He stands up and says, yeah, it actually is. And so the librarian, sort of embarrassed, says, yep, I think so.
All
If
those
you don't have a
standing.
seat, you have to go out. And so then they file out, and now all these Christians and 0 kids are in this room. This guy does his performance, and they all just sit there quietly. They're not rude. They're not there to offend him. They're there to protect children and establish this is not right in our community. I think it's amazing. So that kind of like this, that I feel like what that is, and this is why I still connect with that nationalism idea, is it's Christians saying this is our town. You don't get to do this here. And feeling that ownership and then flexing a little bit. I think that's really good.
So I wouldn't have a problem with that, but as you were telling me the story, I was feeling discomfort at certain areas.
Yeah.
And I was saying, where is the discomfort? And I think it is this. Maybe it's a concern. Because what you just described, I like the story.
Yeah.
I like the wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove nature of that story.
Yeah,
right?
there's a little genius going
There's
on
both
in there.
things, and the harmless is there too, right? Both are there. I think that's right. However, my concern is this. What I think is, while that's a good thing for a church to have done, it is not the calling primarily of the church. It's not that it's not a good thing to have done, and even a calling in a moment, but the church's calling is to lift up. There is life in Jesus.
And so
That's
why
its
is that
primary-
important?
Why is that important?
Yeah.
That there's life in Jesus?
No, why is it important to you that to distinguish the church's calling from the everyday Christian?
Because I think that the church can become a political entity, and it has lost its power then. It is not the church anymore. It's another organization. It's the moral majority. It's the Christian right. And it's a political section. It's the evangelicals voting for Trump. It's the evangelicals. It's a block, a voting block.
Right.
And as soon as that happens and that becomes the defining component, the primary component, it is no different. We have no different power than the Elks or whatever other voting block there is.
Well,
the
the
church is a
difference would be that
spiritual
God is
entity.
with us.
Yes, that's right. But would you say right now God is with, in a sense, J.K. Rowling and Greenwald?
Well, to the degree that he's using them
Yeah.
to hold to
That's
uphold,
why I would say
resist evil.
he's with the church. If that's what they became about, it'd
But
be the
that's like-
same dynamic.
No, well, what I'm saying is, one, I don't disagree that I agree that there should be a separate institution called church that is not the government, right? But what I don't understand, because if evangelicals was a real voting bloc, then half the things we're saying shouldn't happen wouldn't be happening, if not more. Because the number
Well-
of people that go to an evangelical church who still vote for baby killing and right, they still want the things that they feel a little awkward about upholding the rule of law in certain ways, and they put up
I
the
would
black
say
square.
evangelicals created 2016.
I
the
think they got
election of Trump.
manipulated into 2016.
No, oh, I don't think so. I think they were the ones that have responded to Trump as they liked him as a Cyrus. They wanted a little mean guy in their side.
If I talk about the Christian nationalists that I've listened to and my own experience,
And I think
Trump
they
was
get-
a hold your nose.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree, but they still voted for him. And then in 2020, a lot of the hold your nose voted for him willingly, but they got out thefted.
Right.
So
So what's the sabotage? Like, what's the problem?
I mean, my point is, you were saying if evangelicals were a voting bloc, they would have done more and more. I think they have done more and more.
Well, there's a small percentage of evangelicals who actually vote, and there's a significant percent who think gay marriage is fine, who think abortion is okay under a certain number of weeks. Like it's not as comprehensive as we think.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of it is that the churches have said, well, we're only going to preach the Bible, therefore we're not going to apply it to these really relevant issues that if you, for example, read the Old Testament and see how sin infiltrates and it turns into a turning away from God, and now our country's doing that because we haven't preached the application.
Yeah.
So I think part of what the reason our country has gone astray is that evangelicalism has turned too much to the we want to be seeker sensitive, we want to be friendly to the world, and if we do, they'll be friendly to us. I think it's all a myth. I think the world is out to destroy, and they were against Christ, and if you stand with them, they'll be against you.
Yeah.
All right, we're at an hour and 30. All right. So I wanted to say this podcast is a part of the Trinity School, which is a culture building enterprise. It includes education, influence, industry, and the arts. If you want to support what's going on at the Trinity School, building communities that honor Christ, you can donate to our efforts by going to gracedayton.com/Trinity School. You've been listening to On Second Thought with Mike and Luke. And if you enjoyed this episode or found something to reconsider, share it with a friend, start a good conversation, and remember, dig a little deeper and think again. We'll see you next time.